or live. How about that? So, hi everybody. Bernard, I want you to know that you won the endowment debate last night. It's going to take you a year to wrap up, but you won.
I guess I didn't hear any, I didn't really feel I felt support for an endowment, but I thought it was a new subject that's still being kind of...
The reason I think you won is the idea of having a mechanism to receive those funds so that they're not piddled away. They bought that A to Z. So now it's just a matter of, walking it through the paces. You got it separated from the discussion that they were voting on, scored that point. Just wrap up now.
Well, that, like you say, I agree, that wrap-up's going to take a while.
Yeah, but the nodding of heads of people who are listening and saying, yeah, these wonderful friends of ours leave us a gift and then we blow it on the electric bill. It's like, we want something worthy of them.
Well, that's good to hear, because honestly, I wasn't paying that much attention to other people's body language at that point.
So anyway, I thought we had a very successful meeting last night, but so welcome, and what did you think? We got through some pages here.
Are we going to watch the video first? Or
Yeah, I just thought we'd hear from folks.
Up until the 7 points, I was good. 7 points need probably a reread.
Okay.
7 mutations away from the Judaistic belief in resurrection. There was some. I need to chew over that.
It's a little deep, yeah.
I was going to say, it's either deep or the style of writing I'm not a fan of. I have a hard time keeping on track. I'm not sure the author is. And it's probably just me.
Yeah,
That's the way the bread's are.
Yeah.
I'd like to see about 8 full dots at the end. 1 sentence for each, telling me, what did you just say?
Okay, that'll work.
Americans would probably be more plain in their speaking or writing. Some, depending on the...
Well, there's a thing on Babylon B this week. The congregation's like up in arms in a riot because the pastor is having a 4th point to the sermon, and the traditional is 3 points in a hymn. And anyway, so everybody doing pretty good though.
There were a lot of interesting
I think so too.
points that he made early on. It was kind of surprising that it's not real hopeful about where Western Christianity is heading.
Yeah, it is kind of scary.
I mean, he was even going after some of the hymns that are have been sung for forever in the church. It's like, how great thou art.
I know.
It's like, wow.
It was very interesting, and I think the title of the book is good because when you're first reading it, you think the title should be
Depressed by reality.
Yeah.
Let's say surprised.
Maybe that's at the very end.
You know what it made me do after I read the first? He does not have a children's book.
He doesn't.
He does not, and I'm going to call him and reach out to him and say, "No, wait a minute, buddy,"
He's at Oxford now.
because I think
You could write him a letter and say, we heard about your 5th grade boys Sunday school class, but how about
I've been writing down.
how about a children's book?
Because it made me think when he was talking about Maria Shriver and her book in here. I was like, yeah. After I never really read her book. I I knew she had it out, but I didn't really look at it. And I'm like, wait a minute, Mr. Wright.
Yeah, the right Reverend Wright.
Yeah, so.
And it's interesting because he is, right now, in Great Britain, there's lots of universities like there are here, but the big ones are Oxford, Cambridge, St. Andrews, Trinity College in Dublin. Those are the big name ones in the UK and Ireland. And he is in the same career field and so forth with C.S. Lewis. And Lewis made the distinction between the intelligentsia, who are all these smart people, but they can't communicate what they do to the normal person. And that group of people that Lewis was a part of, called the Inklings, they met for beer and steak for breakfast at this pub, like on a weekly basis. And two of them are J.R.R. Tolkien, who of course Lord of the Rings, but he was famous for Old English. Like, he recited Beowulf in Old English in front of an audience of like 35,000 people at one point in time. Lewis was a medieval and Renaissance literature professor who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, of equally significant but lesser known space trilogy, and then some very serious things, like one that speaks very much to today about men without chests, like an honorless, virtueless society, and yet he wrote this series of children's books. And Tolkien thought Narnia was not very good. He really criticized it. There were Wilson wrote a 5-part set of novels that very philosophical. I read it one time and could barely get through it, and don't think I understood a tenth of it. Dorothy Sayers was part of the group. So that really intense intellectual people who were also able to speak as novelists and children's books and so forth. So, good point. Well, let's see what Jan Video has to say, and then we'll
One of the fascinating things about Escombe Church here is that it's much closer in date to the time of Jesus himself than it is to our day. It was built within 700 years of the time of Jesus, and we are now 1,400 more years out beyond that. But it isn't just that. We're surrounded here by old tombstones from several different periods, and a lot of them have got inscriptions which actually tell you what people believed about life after death and what hope there might be. So there's one inscription here which has a nice little poem which actually expresses the classic Christian hope. It says, "Go home, dear friends, and leave us here, and let us lay till Christ appear. When Christ appears, we hope to have a joyful rising from the grave." Now that is the mainstream Christian hope. We're resting here at the moment. This isn't the end of the story. Jesus is going to return, and when he returns, there will be a resurrection. All these graves, like in all English churchyards, they're all facing east, so that it was assumed that Jesus would rise like the sun in the east, and then they would all stand up to greet him when he arrived. That is the classic Christian hope. But for many, for the last 150 years or so, the hope has been transformed into something quite different. It's just about, for many people now, going to heaven when you die. No mention of resting and then something else. No mention of a bodily resurrection. Just an abandoning of this world and a flying off somewhere else. And indeed, in this very churchyard, there are some of the graves which tell it like that. So many people are confused about this that it's really important we study it carefully. And that's what this session is going to be all about.
So what exactly happened to Jesus 3 days after he was executed? Why did the early Christians use that strange word resurrection when they wanted to say what they thought had happened? And what can we say about our view of what they were thinking? To answer those quite interesting questions, I found it helpful to go back and track a bit through what people in the first century believed about what happened to people after they died. You can divide those views broadly into two, ancient pagan views and ancient Jewish views. The ancient pagans had a whole range of things they believed. After all, some of the Roman emperors believed that when they died, they were going to become gods and their female family goddesses. But there were many other views as well. Some ancient pagans just believed that when you died, that was it, that was the end. You find on some ancient tombstones a little Latin tag which basically means, once upon a time I wasn't, once I was, now I'm not, and I don't care. That was quite a common view in those days. But there were others who took a more cheerful view that your body would die and decay, but that your soul would go somewhere really nice and pleasant and live there for a long time. Or others of them believed that your soul would rest a while and then would come back into a different body. You would turn into somebody else, and so on and so on. There are lots of variations on those beliefs. The Jewish people had less variety, but still some. Some of them seem to have believed that death really was the end. Some of them seem to have believed that the soul would go off somewhere else. But interestingly, leading up to the period of the time of Jesus, a significant number of Jewish people really did believe that one day, not instantly, but that one day, God would raise from the dead all his people, perhaps even the whole human race, but certainly all his people or all his righteous people. And when they used that resurrection idea, they didn't mean a soul going off into the blue yonder. They meant somebody being raised from the dead physically so that they were really themselves again, perhaps even more so. So we have to ask the question, not only why did the early Christians say that that's what happened to Jesus, but interestingly, what did they think would happen to them and to all people sooner or later? This is particularly striking because across many cultures, including contemporary cultures, the things that people believe about life after death and the things they say about that, somebody's funeral for instance, tend to be very conservative. You tend to say pretty much what people said to you when you were young, because it's a time, a very solemn time, for sticking with what you know and where the tradition has left you. But fascinatingly, all the early Christians for whom we have evidence right across the first 100 and 200 years of Christianity, they all said that what was going to happen was resurrection. In other words, they went for one option and only one option out of that whole range of ancient pagan and Jewish worldviews. So it's a question that the historian has to ask. Why did they all change their minds and go for this one? They had other options. Why did they plump for this and only this? Of course, their answer was, the reason we're going this route is that Jesus of Nazareth was raised from the dead. So we have to go back and look at the stories they told about what had happened. And when we go back to the books we call the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we find that each of them tells the story of the first Easter day in some significantly different ways. And that's fascinating because, if they'd got together 40 or 50 years later and said, it's time we actually wrote up a story that'll convince people, they wouldn't have done it like that. They'd have cobbled it together and made sure that all the details matched exactly. But the stories don't look like that. They look more like what you'd get if there was an extraordinary event, a road accident or a plane crash or something, and everyone in the breathless hours after that happened telling it like they'd seen it, often with bits and pieces of details upside down and inside out. That's a bit how the Gospels read at that point. But there are other odd things about those stories which make me as a historian think that they really have the ring of this is how they told it at the beginning. For instance, very interestingly, the women, Jesus' followers who were women, play a very significant and striking role in all of them. The men are away hiding somewhere. Jesus' male followers thought that the authorities were going to come after them as well. But the women were the first at the tomb, and they were the first to go and tell people. Now, feminists among us may think, well, isn't that great? Fine, and pass on. But it's more interesting than that. Because in the first century world, women were not regarded as credible witnesses. In other words, again, if you were making up these stories 5 weeks or 50 years later, you would never have invented women as your primary witnesses. But there they are, front and center in the stories. Something very strange is going on here. In addition, the portrait of Jesus in those resurrection stories is fascinating, because in some of the Jewish speculations about resurrection, they seem to be saying that people will come back exactly as they were before, no change, back into the same body, the same sort of physical life, and you'll just have it all over again. Whereas others among the people who speculate about resurrection seem to be saying that when we're raised, we'll be like stars in the heaven, we'll be shining like heavenly bodies. Interestingly, in the stories in the Gospels, neither of those is true. Obviously, Jesus is not shining like a star. They would have said that if that had been how it was. He appears to begin with as somebody just like them, and he eats and he drinks with them, and he can be touched. But then there are very strange things that happen as well, because sometimes he appears and disappears, and sometimes they don't know quite what's going on. Is he really there? They thought he was a ghost, and then it turns out he isn't after all. And again, I have to say, if they'd been making up stories later in order to say, there you are, he's really physical after all, they wouldn't have done it like this. One of the leading scholars of our day, who is not himself actually a practicing Christian, has put it like this: it looks as if they were trying to say something for which they knew they didn't have very good language. In other words, something new is going on here. What was it, this new thing? Well, we can track back historically and say that the only way that they would have told stories like that was if two particular things had happened. On the one hand, there must really have been an empty tomb, which they knew was Jesus' tomb. And on the other hand, there must have been meetings with someone, sightings of someone who they took to be Jesus himself. If you didn't have the first, they would have said that those sightings were just hallucinations. They knew as much about hallucinations as we do. If you didn't have the second, they would have said, oh, well, the tomb has been robbed. Tomb robbery was quite common in the ancient world, particularly of well-known people, because robbers would hope that there might be jewels or other valuable goods in the grave with them. It really does look as though the tomb was empty and there were real meetings with Jesus. And you can go through all the options, all the skeptical accounts of, oh, well, it must have been like this or that or the other. But actually, I and many others have done that. And the answer is no, they don't work. They don't explain the rise of the early Christian faith. The only way to explain it is to say that Jesus hadn't just been resuscitated back into the same life. He had done something quite new. He had gone, as it were, through death and out the other side with a new sort of body, of which there had been no previous example, and of which to this day there remains no subsequent instance. Now the skeptic will say, well, that's utterly ridiculous, and the early Christians knew then that it was indeed ridiculous, and many people said that. But actually they discovered that what they said about their experience of meeting Jesus and knowing him to be alive somehow began to change everything. and they discovered that resurrection wasn't just something that happened to Jesus. Resurrection meant that God's new creation had begun. The new world had already started, not with a great bang and suddenly everything being transformed overnight, but with this one prototypical event which was going to generate and drive a whole new world. And you can see that they believe that in the way that they tell the stories. In John's Gospel, in chapter 20, when he is describing what happened on that very first Easter day, he reminds us that it was the first day of the week. And a little bit later in the chapter, he says it's the first day of the week. And you might think, well, what's so special about that? And the answer is John has written his gospel very carefully, in such a way as to remind us of the great sequence in the book of Genesis, the great sequence of creation. And he's now saying, this is a new creation. This is the first day of the new week. Because the point that he's making, as they all do, is that the story doesn't go like this. Jesus died, Jesus was raised, therefore that's all right, we get to go to heaven. No, resurrection is about a new bodily life in this world and for this world. What they are saying is that the resurrection of Jesus means that God's new creation has begun, and therefore we have a job to do. Our calling then, in the light of Easter, is to be, as it were, advance foretastes of that new creation. That is to say, we are to be in ourselves both the beneficiaries of it and the agents of it. What exactly does that mean? It means, to begin with, that the power which was launched at Easter was like a great explosion of God's new power in the whole world. That power is to transform our lives. That's what happens when somebody discovers that the message of Jesus seems to be bubbling up inside them and making them think and feel and behave differently. But it's never just something for ourselves. Jesus spoke earlier in John's Gospel about the living water which he would give, but he didn't just say, I'll give you the living water for you. He says that you are to be somebody out of whom that living water will flow. And for somebody living in the Middle East then or now, living water is pretty important. If you're in the desert, you need that water. You need fresh water to drink, to be refreshed, to stop from starving and getting totally overheated. Our lives are to be like that. God's intention is to flood the dry and dusty creation with his new life, and we are to be people through whom that happens. And that can be through the gifts that God has given us of maybe creativity, of artistic work, through the passion that God gives us to make justice happen in his world. It can be through the tenderness and kindness that we find bubbling up within ourselves to go and look after people who badly need it. And so often in our world, there are plenty of people very close at hand who come into that category. One way or another, we are to be, as I said, not only the beneficiaries for ourselves of that new creation, we are to be people through whom it happens out there in God's world.
Did that match up with the 7? I found a place where there's 7 listed at the.
He didn't really go into it here. He was saying there's 7 mutations of the Judaical belief on resurrection.
Okay.
So that was like, I need to go back over them, I think. I didn't even take notes on them. They were kind of like...
I think he touched on that a little bit at the beginning when he was making the point that they chose resurrection as the one answer that Christianity is presenting of all the options that are out there. Did I get that right?
Perhaps. I'm just going back to that. He made 7 points about. That was the last part.
Is that? Do you remember where?
Yeah, it starts on page. What's it? The whole chapter. It's. Oh my goodness. surprising character of early Christian hope, page
Okay.
40. And it goes, that actually covers that to the end of the chapter. So, and I think that's where he said that our belief, Christians' current belief in resurrection, is more pharisaical. It's more in line with pharisaical Judaism.
Yeah. Okay.
Just the Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection.
Yeah, I was going to say that within Judaism in the first century, you also had the what?
Is that camera where you want it?
I just moved it so it was pointing into the room.
Okay.
From a historical perspective, when the Jews returned from Babylon, they were under Persian rule. And Zoroastrianism was the religion of the Persian Empire. And there are some remarkable points of contact with Zoroastrianism that when you think, okay, this is the religion of the ruling government, and this is a province that's got to do business in that government, it's not unusual that there's a certain amount of cross-pollination of ideas and language and so forth. Alexander the Great's got a great date to remember him by. 333 BC is kind of in the middle of Alexander's conquest. And so his basic story is his father invented the Greek phalanx. Alexander exploited it and knocked off the Persian Empire and marched his army all the way to Afghanistan. And so the whole of the eastern end of the Mediterranean, from Egypt all the way around to Afghanistan, up Greece and Macedonia, that whole sweep of the eastern end of the Middle East of the world fell under Greek influence with Alexander's army. And he introduced Hellenism, which they had their little mythology that we still, like one of my granddaughters is reading Greek mythology as part of her school curriculum, and Zeus and so forth. But that was part of the popular religion. Alexander the Great had a tutor named Aristotle. So that Plato's academy, Aristotle was one of Plato's students, disagreed with him. If you remember the painting in the Vatican of the School of Athens, the old guy's pointing up, and there's another guy with his hand like this. That's Plato and Aristotle, and the whole difference of Plato thinking that there are these idealized forms that we're aware of, and then he used the example of a chair. I know this is a chair because I have this image of the ideal chair in my head, and this particular chair reflects that image. And Aristotle was like, there is no image up there. You understand a chair is something you can put your butt on and it'll hold you up off the ground, and all of them together down here cause you to think of a category. So one's ideal form, the other one's a bunch of particulars, and their philosophies flow from that. Alexander introduced that all over his conquest by creating Alexandrias. So the most famous one is Alexandria in Egypt, but there were a couple dozen more. And he did things like they would conscript new soldiers in Macedonia and send them out, and he'd send others back and give his people an opportunity to settle in Alexandria, marry a local girl, and spread Hellenism throughout the region. So that gets introduced in the Persian province of Judea, which was part of the satrap of the provinces beyond the Euphrates River. And you now have, entering into the Jewish world, Greek ideas, to the point where just take Simon Peter, for example. He's got a Hebrew name, Simon, and a Greek name, and they're joined. And the language that they speak is Greek. 1,000 years from now, when people are looking at the post-World War II era and America, it's our version of English, it's our music, it's our movies, it's our commerce. And from a sort of a historical anthropological perspective, you look at say a protest group and they're speaking English using American ideas, American institutions, and so forth to prove that they're not American. It means they're nothing apart from the parent culture. So that gets entered into the world of first century, Second Temple Judaism. And you had gymnasiums introduced, and Greeks were famous for the Olympiad and sound mind and sound body, and they trained naked, and these are anathema to traditional Judaism. There were even people that were kind of trying to concoct surgeries to reverse circumcision. That's how Greek they wanted to be. You have the story of Daniel that's written in 165 BC time frame, and it has all these ancient empires all the way up to the Greeks, but you had the Greek kingdom based in Damascus trying to wipe out Judaism and make them all be Greek, and the Antiochus Epiphanes, their king, comes down and sacrifices a pig on the altar of Jerusalem, and then wants everybody to make a libation offering, which is a wine you pour on the ground, and you do it as a sacrifice in honor of the gods or some god or whatever. And he sent agents all over the land of Israel to do this, and the Hasmonean family, it's a priestly family in the hills outside of Jerusalem, they killed the Greek agents instead of making the sacrifice, and started a war that ends up with them barely attacking into Jerusalem and getting the Temple Mount, and they try to reinstitute authentic worship of Yahweh in the Temple at Jerusalem. And when they get there, there's enough oil for the menorah in the holy place to burn for a day, and it takes 8 days to consecrate oil. So they have the priests start the process of making the oil, and they light the candelabra, and it burns for 8 days. And they celebrate that every winter, called Hanukkah. Okay, so this stuff is still with us, but the Greeks brought with them their ideas, which, be honest, are really attractive. Our civilization is dependent upon it. The American government is a learning process from Athens and Rome and our founding fathers saying, all right, we want a representative republic. We don't want a pure democracy, because that always devolves down into mob rule. We want to learn these lessons from the past, but you can't understand the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence if you don't understand Aristotle. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is not me doing whatever I want to do, it's me seeking a moral good. That's what happiness is in Aristotle. And the founding fathers were drilled in this stuff, and when they created our government that we're struggling to communicate to the next generation here in 2021, goes all the way back to these Greek ideas. So when we look at the fundamental question is, why am I here? Here I am, some kind of animal on this planet with certain capabilities that other animals don't have. It's not that they don't think, that they don't speak, it's that we have this combination of things that makes the human being really unique in the animal kingdom. So who are we and why are we? And you start wrestling with that, and Greek philosophy tries to speak to it, religions try to speak to it. We come up with all kinds of ideas, and that why am I here question takes its ultimate form around death, because death sits there in the middle of the room, and whenever there is a death, it stops everything. I was listening to the radio, and Glenn Beck was talking about he missed last week because of a family emergency, and he spent 30 minutes on Monday saying, I need to tell you about why I wasn't here. His brother-in-law committed suicide, and it's the third suicide in Beck's family, immediate family, and he passionately was trying to get people to take it seriously. If you see these signs, get the person into help. You drag him to the emergency department, if nothing else. He's a good storyteller and moving people to tears, telling this tragedy about death. And this is where Christianity hits the road, in my opinion. Jesus going to the cross, sins, some people take that very seriously, other people I don't understand, and so forth, but we all get what happens at death. How do we know? I personally don't know anybody that's gone through that and come back to talk about it, other than Jesus. And he was annoyingly cryptic, which he'd said more. So we get fascinated with near-death experiences, I think they call them, movies, like there was one, was it 21 grams or something, that these medical students are trying to push people right to the, how far can we push them into death and get them back, that kind of a science fiction. We're fascinated by it because, basically there is no coming back. You can get close. The guy that wrote the Book of God, Walt Wangren, was on hospice, and then he went into remission. Lance Armstrong's got a book called It's Not About the Bike, and what that book is really about is he didn't have a snowball's chance in a warm and fiery place of surviving, and a month later he walked out of the hospital, and his whole orientation was to death, it's over, and then he was alive. What do you do? So we're fascinated by this. How do we know? Where do you get good answers?
I've talked to some pastors over the years about that when you've been bedside, and I've gotten responses that, are, I wouldn't want to say 100% reassuring, because I've also heard about some bad ones. I saw one happen a few years ago. I was in a room with a classmate of mine, and he was in and out of it, and they told us that he probably had a day, maybe. And everything was quiet, and I was sitting over to the side, and he started to do this, raising his hands in this motion. I didn't say anything because, he then laid there again. And so people came back in and what have you, and I talked to one of the nurses that was there. She said, no, she said, what happens sometimes is people see loved ones. That's what they were telling me. And this whole thing about the transformation of Jesus, the new body, and coming back, and being on a, and I know this is going to sound super weird, but in a different level. They're here, but you don't see them, and there's a barrier here, and that's what it is. This world as we know it is solid, visual, what have you. I have a hard time, and always had a hard time with looking at people that live to be 20, 50, whatever, 150, whatever, and dying. That's all there was to it. That always has tricked me into knowing or tricking my mind as to, don't just think for a second that the sum total of your life is you're going to get up, maybe catch a disease, run over by a car, who knows, and it's all over, and that's it. That's the end. It just shows me the total uselessness of life. If that's all there is, what was the point of any of this? And that has always kept me thinking that there has to be more. And unfortunately for us right now, the only way that you'll find that out is one day, and I don't care whether it's 3 seconds after you terminally are pronounced dead, or 50 years of laying in Mount Bethel. You know, I just truly have always believed that there was more to this than this life itself.
And I think that's quintessentially human. That sense of, I think there's more. Can't prove it, but I think there's more.
I know I'll get off the tangent here for a second, but even the weird programs that I'll watch every now and then about the paranormal, and you see some of this stuff, and this is the thing about our technology. We may not be able to see them physically, but I have seen things that have happened that you got to look at and think, how did that just take place? How did this stuff happen? Something moved that, something made this happen right in front, but you didn't see it. So it's not just your mind playing tricks on you. I truly believe that. I personally, I just believe that when somebody passes away, within a second, you're at another level. Because now the scary thing about this is we always talk about the resurrection of the body. Well, cremation has been around for an awful long time. And that always kind of concerns me about the body itself intact in a casket in the ground deteriorates over time. But there's something there, at least the structure of the bones. If you know what cremation is about and you look at that and think, how's it going to put all that back together? Especially when somebody has their ashes scattered from here to the West Coast.
Well, he touched on a lot of that in the book, in the first part we're reading about how even Western Christianity is moving eastward towards Hinduism and what's the other one? Buddhism, where you're just a drop in the bucket in a Buddhism. You're just winds.
Yeah, the end game in Buddhism
Toss
is
your
to cease to
ashes to
exist.
the wind, and he touched on that. So,
Well, in burial practice tends to reflect, you bury people according to what you think is the appropriate way to do it based on what you know. And of course, as Americans, money. Yeah. I don't know what the price is right now, but a few years ago, the Pennsylvania Cremation Society was like, we'll pick up the body and send you a package in the mail for $500.
that's what my mother wanted. So I still have her ashes.
It gets even worse.
She was of labor.
Yeah. Clergy and funeral homes have this weird relationship with one another. And a friend of mine who's a mortician said, "Hey, look at this new catalog I got," and then custom caskets. You know, one of them looks like a UPS package with a stamp on it, return to sender.
Well, it brings my mind outside of this little circle of folks who we go to funerals and we have these traditions. What about the little older lady or baby that lives in Africa or wherever, who has never once in their entire lives heard the word Jesus? That's where my mind goes.
Yeah, the only good answer I ever heard on that, Lyman Lundeen said, he looked around the room at all of us, and he goes, "If you don't remember anything else, remember this: God is bigger than you think."
Mm-hmm. Because you can't tell me that just because somebody doesn't know the words, God is not going to be like, okay, no.
What are you going to say?
I don't buy it.
I was going to ask, does a Christian church have a philosophy on cremation versus bodily burial?
There are well over 100,000 incorporated Christian denominations in the United States.
Okay, but let's go to something that's more centrally controlled. Catholic Church. What do they say?
They used to say no, and I honestly don't know if there's been any movement on that at all.
They supposedly now said that I've attended a few at Holy Trinity over the years, and as long as the body is
Kept together.
together, and that's now acceptable.
Well, I mean, first of all, we're dealing with a God who's bigger than we think. Some of the things we know about this God are, let there be light, and there's light. So I'm not worried about God's ability to reconstitute scattered ashes, and because honestly, in the military, every once in a while you run into some things that are pretty grim, and that the normal funeral here is designed for the living, and they do things like they take your glasses off and put them next to you, like somehow in the next life you're going to need them. Human beings have always put things with dead bodies, flowers and pots, pans, swords, helmets. Great Viking lords are burned in Viking ships with their household staff, and we've always done things like that. But
Especially the Egyptians.
yeah, I mean it's kind of that sense that there's something more, and where the Jesus event comes in is you have this, I'm going to say young, but he's 30 something. When I read the Gospels, they said it's a 3-year public ministry because there's 3 Passovers mentioned in John. Well, logically, I think there were at least 33 Passovers from the time that he was born. So why pick 3? Why not some other number? And when I look at what we have, if Jesus suddenly appeared on the scene and did everything that we have, he would have scared the crap out of all of the political and power brokers of the age. It would have been scrambling. Who is he? What's he about? Can I control him? Let's get rid of him. That looks like 9 to 12 months to me. And he comes out of the north in the Galilee, driving for Jerusalem. Luke says he set his face for Jerusalem, heading for the Passover. We don't know how long his public ministry lasted. He started out associated with John, whom they arrested and executed. So he's running in a controversial circle from the get-go, and he's intelligent, he's charismatic, he's doing things that nobody ever did before, giving sight to the blind, mobility to people who've been lame since birth. You know, think about the physical therapy of that. You know, if you're an athlete and you stop working out in 2 weeks, you start over. And this guy is over 40, and he's never been able to bear weight on his ankles, and Jesus heals him, and he's jumping. You know, that is a biological impossibility by the normal consideration, and yet Jesus did it, and everybody knew the guy.
But the disciples also did that too.
Yep.
They actually, this is something that I not deep into the religious studies or anything else. I do remember reading some of this where they had been out and the blind, and was it Peter that actually brought one back from the dead or a sign? One of them did this.
Yeah.
Actually raised a person.
If you read Acts, the first half of the book is focused on Peter, and he does the same things that Jesus does. And then Stephen's murder by Saul, and then the second half of Acts is the ministry of Saul turned into Paul, and he does the same kinds of things. So Peter and John are going up to the temple, and the guy says, hey, you're going to give me some money. And he famously says, silver and gold have I none, but such as I have I give you. In the name of Jesus, stand up and walk. Jesus did that, raising the dead. Nobody did this stuff. You know, there were exorcists and so forth, but what Jesus was doing was on a whole different level, and heading to Jerusalem for the Passover, which is all about the angel of death going over the houses where the blood of the lamb's on the lintels and doorposts. And, you know, John's gospel, the big hint at the beginning is John the Baptist goes, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. That summarizes Jesus of Nazareth, who he is, why he came. And he goes, and then, as he said, he was handed over, tried, crucified, dead, buried, and on the third day he rose again. The old blowing up with, you know, the switch up the clay horn. Nobody had ever seen this, and it's never been done before. He pops into the room on Easter evening and takes a piece of fish and eats it. In the Alpha course, Nicky Gumbel had a friend that converted to Christianity on the basis of that verse. First of all, the guy said it was really fish and chips. They just forgot to mention the chips. But Jesus' proof was ghosts don't eat. And he picks up a piece of broiled fish and he eats it in front of him. In King James, and he ate it. And that was brand new.
Did the Jews believe any of this? I mean, I know they don't believe Jesus was Messiah, and yet they were the ones where the idea of resurrection came from. So did they have any say one way or the other that Jesus was resurrected?
Well, this has been a dilemma from the get-go. Once again, in John's prologue, he came to his own, and his own did not receive him. So that this is an area of serious concern from the very beginning. For example, on Pentecost, they pour out into the streets, and they are under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, speaking the good news. And good news is a technical phrase that when it's used most commonly, it is somebody bursting in the room with a news flash of some unexpected victory. And so they're out in the street proclaiming, this is what God has done in Jesus. And there are people that respond. On Pentecost, 3,000 men got baptized. A little bit later, there's a couple thousand more. So the church is drawing people, but they're also drawing fire. The people that killed Jesus didn't appreciate Peter before the Sanhedrin, the body that condemned Jesus and handed him over to the Romans. Peter standing in front of them going, this Jesus, oh, by the way, whom you crucified, but God raised from the dead. They didn't like that. And they told him, we don't want you preaching in this name. And he goes, well, figure it out. Should we listen to you or God? So there's a fundamental confrontation there. Paul's ministry, he mimics Jesus. He goes into a town where there's a synagogue, and he goes straight to the synagogue, and he presents himself as a Pharisee, a student of the great Rabbi Gamaliel, who's the grandson of the really great Rabbi Hillel, impeccable credentials within the Jewish world of the first century. I've just come from Jerusalem and there's news. And they listen to him for a while, and there's a back and forth. In the early phases of Paul's ministry, the back and forth usually ends with him getting kicked out and the people who have come to believe what he's saying leaving with him. There's a place called Dura Europa, and there's a synagogue, and right next door to it a Christian house church. And it's like the dilemma was, why don't they buy this? And in Romans, for example, there's a whole section in there about you Gentiles are like a wild olive branch that's been grafted onto a cultivated tree, and the space that you're taking up was intended for Jews who rejected the message, and so God grafted you in. And oh, by the way, if he can graft you in, he can cut you out, so don't think too much of yourself. Keep your humility. And to this day, I support an organization called One for Israel. They're all Israelis, native born. They've all done their IDF tours, and that kind of stuff. And they're evangelical Christians. And they have honed in on internet as a great open marketplace. And they do podcasts, and they have interviews with people who, the storyline is always, I grew up Jewish, and then I ran into Yeshua, the Messiah, and now I'm really Jewish. That's the storyline. There's 112 of those videos at this point in time. And they have drawn fire from the rabbinical community because the American comedian Jackie Mason, he's an Orthodox Jew, and just gets rabidly angry over Jews for Jesus and some of those groups, and you immediately run into the Jews can be a very passionate people, and when they're arguing about protecting Judaism in a post-Holocaust world, they call it Hashoah, the slaughter. It's like when there's blood, it's no longer funny. And they had just this past 2 weeks, a very famous Israeli rabbi put up a post on his site. He has millions of followers, that the two principal speakers for One for Israel had gone to a meeting in Netanya with a famous older Jewish rabbi, and they dragged him out of the cafe and beat him up and broke some bones and so forth. Put this out. Didn't happen. The truth of the story is that 7 or 8 years ago, an Israeli regular army officer who was a member of this guy's synagogue and was being drawn in his own studies towards Jesus was talking to his rabbi about it, which is, right conversation. And the rabbi said, well, can I meet these people? And so they met and they had coffee together. And the two people from One for Israel said that they participated in the conversation, but as minimally as possible, and that this Israeli army officer and his rabbi talked back and forth. And when it was over, they shook hands and said, it's nice to have met you, blah, blah, blah. And they went their separate ways. That's the truth. So the guys from One for Israel wrote the rabbi and said, this is what's being said. And of course, that's not our memory of it. And the rabbi wrote back, it's not my memory of it either. And he wrote out a detailed reminiscence of this meeting at this coffee shop and disavowed being attacked or debated or beaten up or anything else. The Israeli army officer is still on active duty, and he wrote up about it, and he said, I became convinced that all of the scriptures point to Yeshua as Messiah. I've been baptized. I've been a Christian for 7 years, a follower of Yeshua. And so they took these two written affidavits and they sent them to the guy that was making the story up and asked him if he would please take his stuff down. And instead of backing down, he's doubled down. And so the guys from One from Israel decided, we've got to go public with this in order that there be our understanding of what happened out in the public venue. So, that's last week.
Yeah, really?
So,
Wow.
there are many, many wonderful people who they look at the scriptures, they look at the life of Jesus, and they go, no, I don't see it. And from our perspective, unless the Holy Spirit is calling you, you can't believe. There's a God factor in who comes to faith and when.
And I think when he said about language, I think language is one of the barriers, big time. Like the Holy Spirit is in place of language, almost. If you think of it that way. And I also wonder, it takes my mind when he was saying about the women, why the women at that point were the first ones. And I don't think anybody here would disagree that the way women think and the way men think are very different. So that could be the why, just like Aristotle and Plato. It's kind of that thought.
Well, with the women, you're in a totalitarian situation with the Roman military and their national flunkies in a society that tends to kind of ignore women and keep them back and so forth. So if the male disciples were doing anything, that would almost invariably draw attention from police/military looking for the followers of this troublemaker that we just executed. And the women with their dress, the veils are not a Muslim thing, they're a Middle Eastern thing because there's a lot of dirt flying around and so forth. So the women can come and go in places almost unseen socially. They were present all along, and they were present at the crucifixion. And as I read it, only John among the apostles is at the cross. But Jesus' mother's there, his aunt's there, that group of women that traveled with him, they're there and not afraid. I find it really stupid that somebody says, well, they went to the wrong tomb. Of course it was empty, they were at the wrong place. And it's like, I don't know of any mother who doesn't know where her baby's buried.
That's right.
Not possible. They don't make that kind of mistake. And there was a burial of sorts that was somewhat truncated on Friday because of the Sabbath setting in. So, the followers of Jesus, to include at least 2 members of the Sanhedrin, which are the absolute elite of Israel at the time, they're present doing the ritual, and because of the propensity not to mention women, I would not be surprised to find out that Mary Magdalene and Susanna and Mary, the other Mary, that they were all there. The fact that they don't get mentioned is common. So they, going back early on the first day of the week in order to finish that way of honoring the dead and doing the preparation and so forth. Of course they're there. But go ahead.
Was it custom maybe for the women to do the preparation of the bodies for dead?
Yeah, and when you read the rabbinical material, it was perfectly fine for women to wash and anoint and be involved in the process of preparing for burial of anybody. It was okay for men to do men, but it was not okay for men to do women. So like if there's a woman's dead, women are going to prepare the body, not men. That I know is in the rabbinical literature. And so they have, the bottom line up front on this is they were doing this burial in concert with the Pharisaic understanding of a general resurrection and judgment at the end of time. The thing that's really a surprise about Jesus is nobody was expecting Messiah to raise first. There's this interesting little thing with the festivals. There's a feast called First Fruits. Passover is an agricultural harvest festival, and a part of it is the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, and then the Passover, and then there's and I can't get it right, so I'm not going to say it, but the bottom line up front is on a certain day after the Sabbath and the Passover, there's the Feast of First Fruits, and that's the day that Jesus rose from the dead. And hence Paul says, hallelujah, Christ our Passover sacrificed for us. And then he'll say he's the first fruits of them that sleep, which is a way of talking about raising from the dead. And then the next festival is Pentecost, or the giving of the Word of God. You have the giving of the Holy Spirit. This Messiah raising as the first fruits and doing things like popping in the room going, "Can I have some of your fish and chips?" That is what blows them away. And that's what he's talking about. They're trying to describe something that they know their language and concepts isn't big enough to handle, and yet it's real. And then they are sent out to bear witness to it. And that's where Jesus' resurrection and our hope of resurrection are connected. And as we've been talking, we're already in the kingdom. It's not yet fully here. The so-called realized eschatology, or the already but not yet. I always like Jürgen Moltmann's, we joked around about it in seminary, is the divine surfer, where you've got this tsunami of a wave of the kingdom of heaven crashing in on the earth, and Jesus is like Joe Surfer blowing in, and here we are standing there, still part of this earth, and we're in the kingdom, and we live in that turmoil of the surf hitting the beach, and some of what was true is still going on, and some of what's coming is happening already, and that's where we live. If you want to know what time it is, that's where you are. And so in the creed we go, and I believe in the bodily resurrection of the dead and the life everlasting. So, yeehaw.